Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 2016 Trends webcast from Scriptorium. My name is Sarah O'Keefe, and I am here with a number of my coworkers. I'll introduce them in a second. Welcome aboard. We're glad to have you. The very first thing I want to get out of the way before we go anywhere else is to ask you to start searching for the questions pane in GoToWebinar, because we are going to be asking you to leave your questions and your comments and your general participation in that questions tab. Depending on what kind of an interface you're in, it can be a little challenging to find. So welcome aboard. You can blame my coworker Gretyl for the small animal theme this year. First off, Content 2016 is our hashtag today, and I will be, as moderator, keeping an eye on that, so please do try to comment there if you can. Now, let's meet our contestants for today. We have three esteemed panelists. Alan Pringle, who is
Hello.
our... Hey, Alan, how's your audio?
Hey.
You sound good. Okay,
Good.
So he is our content strategy lead, does a bunch of implementation management, and co-authored Content Strategy 101. I have Bill Swallow. Bill?
Hey, how are you?
There you are. Bill is up in the frozen north, which currently I think might beat the icy south, so I'm not totally sure how that works out. He's up in Albany, New York. The rest of the team is here in Durham, North Carolina with me. Bill's focus is on global TechCom practices, process improvement, and in particular issues around localization. So those are the kinds of things that he typically focuses into in dealing with our work. And Gretyl Kinsey.
Hello,
Gretyl,
how are you?
There?
Yes.
There you are. Gretyl does a lot of work around plugins, business case analysis, content strategy tools, and her hamster does play a starring role at some point in this presentation.
Yes, I believe he shows up on the first slide.
He was on the very first slide?
He'll show up on the first
remote.
trend slide.
The first trend slide with the TV remote, I do believe. And what is the hamster's name?
His name is Thor.
Thor. And that tells you everything you need to know about Gretyl. So moving along. My name's Sarah O'Keefe. I'm the chief troublemaker here, and I am glad to have all of you on board. I can see that we have people from all over the world that are logged in, and so welcome, and thank you for getting up early, staying up late, or taking your lunch hour or whatever it may be at this point. So a couple of quick things, how this will work. We have 6 trends. Each participant has 2. We would ask you to jump in with your comments, your questions, your screams of disgust in the questions module. You are muted, beloved attendants, and we are recording this webcast, but your name will not show up. It'll just be the slides and the audio track that you're hearing now. We also have a couple of polls in here, but due to some interesting and unforeseen technical difficulties, we're going to be asking you to provide free-form answers to those polls. So we'll just move right along there and see how it goes. So trend number 1, delivered to us by Thor and Gretyl. Gretyl, would you like to take it away here?
No, this is mine.
This is Alan's
this
trend.
Is yours. You got Thor.
Yeah.
Alan's trend, my
I
hamster.
got Thor. I sure did. Yeah, I borrowed him for this. Yeah, my trend is non-content groups driving content improvements. Lately, I have seen an increase in the numbers of people looking for content strategy help who are not part of what I would consider traditional content creation groups, TechCom, Marcom, and so on. A good example of this is, for example, a product manager who sees a disconnect between the product development team and the creation of the technical and marketing content. There's maybe a lot of us versus them mentality, and that is not made any better because there's a lack of integrated process. There needs to be a much more streamlined review process for content. There needs to be better ways for, say, engineers to contribute content, because I think most all of us know sending bits and pieces of content through email or through a marked up PDF or even worse, marked up hard copy, and yes, it still happens. None of that's very efficient, and there's no accountability. So you have product managers who realize the content processes are broken. I have also seen executives who realize that content is in some manner holding the company back. This is particularly true, I think, in international markets. For example, the time it takes to get content localized is way too long, and therefore that long process cuts into the amount of time a particular release of a product is on the market. So if the localization process gets streamlined, the time to market is shortened, and therefore you have that piece of software or hardware out on the market longer, and you get more money. Now, these executives probably don't know exactly what parts of the content may be causing this long localization process, but they still recognize that the bottleneck is the content. So when you've got product managers and executives seeing content in this manner, I think we need to pay attention to that.
So do the other two of you agree with this? Is this something that you're seeing as well?
I agree with this, and I actually have a trend coming up later that plays off of this, but right now I kind of just wanted to ask a question, which is, Alan, what do you see are some of the implications of this idea of non-content groups being the ones who are driving these changes, and what do you think the effect will be on these companies when that's happening?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is people who are in these content development groups, Marcom, TechCom, etc., I think they need to pay attention to their content and how it really plays into a bigger part of the company's entire picture. It's not just something you're producing because it's your job. It is a business asset, and it needs to be paid attention to as part of the bigger picture. So I think it's kind of forcing the hand of content contributors to take a much more business view of what they're creating and how it fits into the bigger picture.
So for those of you that are on the phone and muted and sort of hypothetically screaming at the TV right now, I did want to ask that question of our audience. Is this something that's happening in your organization? Do you have executives or product development or support or someone else that you consider to be not primarily a content creator group? Are any of those people driving improvements or asking for improvements or paying attention to your content in ways that they haven't? Because I think that's really the trend that we're seeing as a group here. And so my question to the audience is that something that you're seeing in your work or in your industry or just out there as you're participating and working through the market? So I will give you guys a few seconds here. We have Alan. What's the most common one? What's the most common non-content person that drives this?
That's hard to. It's hard for me to quantify, but my knee jerk is probably I'm seeing more and more product line managers, for example.
Okay, and I've got a couple of responses here. One person is saying business analysts, and another one who's saying that
engineering.
Like it is. I think what she's saying is that they are getting pushback from the non-content groups who are saying don't do anything new. I could be wrong. I'm trying to interpret this sentence. Engineers are asking for better training materials for themselves. They need content experts to write better materials, so the engineers recognize perhaps that they're not the best writers in the world. And another commenter is saying, yes, tech support and engineering. Quality assurance, and this is the sad one. I've seen this before. Tech support creates their own docs to fill what they see as gaps in the official docs. You want to talk about that, Alan?
It happens all the time, and that's where you really need to have a content contribution process set up in place so people like support can get content directly into the source and then it can be reviewed. And what I hear too often is this whole, I don't want someone in support or engineering touching my precious content. This is Marcom or TechCom folks, and that's when I have to gently say, it's not your content, it's the company's content. And that's why we need to fold all of this into a single source. It serves everyone much better when everyone's contributing to a centralized source.
Right. So that's an interesting one, which sort of points up, a gap, not even in strategy, but actually in execution. If the tech support people are saying there's stuff missing, we're going to fix it. I have another person saying most changes are driven from tech pubs, but they're getting some support. And one voice in the wilderness who's saying, I've been trying to get non-content folks to see the issues we're having. I'm driving the bus, but they're not paying attention. So I guess from our point of view, there does seem to be a majority that's saying, yes, this is something that we're seeing, which does not help this last poster one tiny little bit to be told that you're the outlier. So we feel your pain, and we've been there. And we do have some thoughts on what you might be able to do there. All right, let's move on and talk about trend number 2.
So this is Bill, and my trend here is regarding multilingual content development, and it kind of really plays into what Alan was just talking about, where you are starting to get collaboration from other groups and other people feeding content in. And the more that companies are breaking down silos between these content groups, and the more that companies are including subject matter experts as part-time source content contributors, you are seeing more and more of a need for a way of managing all this content. And for large companies, that means doing it on a global scale. And in that situation, you have a couple of challenges. First one is that not everyone may speak the same language. And the second challenge is that even if they do speak a shared language, they have a varying command of that language. Not everyone is fluent in it, for example. So there are a couple of approaches that we're seeing people adopt. The first is, if you're fortunate enough to have a shared common language, all these contributions are being created as drafts, and they're being staged so that whatever they write doesn't immediately go back out to whoever needs to consume that information, but it comes in and it's collected, and it's given a thorough editorial pass to clean things up, to make other required editing as needed, so formatting and such. But if there's no shared common language, things get a little interesting. And you have basically 2 main options to approach this. And the first option is what we're typically seeing. It's the more common path. And that's that everyone authors in their native language, and then all of that is translated into one managed single repository. And from that point, it's then reviewed and edited as needed, and from there, that source content in that one language is then translated out to however many languages it needs to go out to, is published into as many different formats as needed. The benefit of doing this is that you have a single managed source to work from. The drawback, unfortunately, is that not all of your contributors may benefit 100% from that managed source, because not everything might be translated in time for them to be able to react to it, to add to it, to improve it. So they have to sit there and wait for the translation to come back in their language before they can even make improvements. The second option is not very typical, but we're starting to see this happen a bit more, and that's that everyone authors in their native languages, just like in the first option, but then everything is translated into all native authoring languages, and it's done kind of on the fly. So as a piece is authored, it's immediately translated into all the other languages so that all the other authors have a chance to see it, and they can then add their own contribution to that piece and edit it and review it and pick it apart, what have you. And then that final piece is then put back together. And then all of these sources are maintained collectively yet independently. The benefit of doing something like this is that all the contributors have a complete set of the managed source, and it's all in their source language, so it's easily understandable to them. They can immediately go in and do what they need to do with that content and get it back out to the other contributors. The drawback here is that there's a real-time translation need, and it requires heavy management. So there are a few things that you can do in any of these situations that can help you out in this multilingual content development environment. The first two are fairly obvious, and a lot of companies are putting this into play whether or not they actually translate, and that's to have a well-defined style guide, and in this case it needs to apply to all languages. And the second is to use a controlled or limited vocabulary in all of these languages so that you keep the costs down when you're localizing, you have a better translation management reflection, and then you can manage your information from that point. Two other things: look for tools that are supporting these multiple source languages, and then have a solid translation management system that's ideally tied into all of these content repositories. And what that will give you is an ability to quickly identify what's changed, what's ready to go, and what translations are still missing.
So I remember seeing an instance of this it had to have been 15 years ago, and I think it was at HP, where they had a particular kind of product that was being built in Korea, and they made the decision that the Korean engineers were critical to the success of the project, which seems logical, but they decided to author the content in Korean and then address, how to get it out to all the other languages they needed and all the rest of it downstream. And at the time, this was a big deal. It was sort of kind of revolutionary. And they ran into some really interesting tooling problems because a lot of the systems available at the time pretty much assumed that there was a single source language and then there were target language, so a one-to-many relationship. They weren't really capable of dealing with a many-to-many kind of relationship between source and target. And in fact, we're still seeing that today. So I wanted to pose the question to the audience as to whether any of you are seeing this kind of thing, and if so, or if not, if you could give me an idea of sort of whether you're in a very large organization or a medium one or a small one. Because I expect that the answer is that the big companies are doing more of this than the small companies, but I'm prepared to be very, very wrong. So Gretyl and Alan, did you have some input on this as well?
I think the only point I would like to make is, well, there's actually two. Clearly, Bill threw out some options there. This is not a one-size-fits-all kind of scenario. It's going to depend heavily on what the needs are of a particular company or department. Also, I have heard people say this, can everybody just work in English? And the answer to that question is sometimes no. And I don't think that's, that to me just shows, I don't know, it doesn't reflect well on the person who says it. It's just, I think that knee-jerk kind of everyone must be in English it just doesn't serve people very well or make them look very good either.
Okay. So let's take a look here at trend number 3. Somebody got the bunnies.
Yes, and so this trend kind of plays off of, I think, both Alan's and Bill's in the sense that it's got this kind of focus on the business aspect of content. And so for this, what I'm starting to see is an uptick in content creators who are having issues with their content, but instead of just seeking out general help, they actually seek help with an idea of a strategy already in mind or some kind of solution in mind. And I think we're going to continue to see more of this in the future. And sometimes these strategies might be kind of in the beginning phase or at sort of a basic formative level. So for example, a company might say something like, we know we're not reusing our content as effectively as we could, and we're developing a reuse strategy, but maybe we could use some guidance from a consultant to make sure that we're considering all of our options and that we're moving in the right direction with reuse. Instead of just saying we need help, they're already focusing on the reuse aspect. And then in some cases, the strategies might even be further along, more complex, and more thoroughly researched and developed. So you might have a company in that case that says something like, we know we need structure, and we've been researching data, and we think it's the right solution for us. And then here are our tentative plans and goals for how we're going to implement that. And we need help, number one, evaluating whether the strategy really is the right one for us. And then number two, putting together a business case so that we can get funding for it. And so this might be evidence of a growing trend that these content creators are starting to become more interested and invested in the big picture and the business aspects of their content. They're starting to care more about strategy, wanting to learn about it, and they're realizing that just creating the content isn't enough anymore. What you do with that content is just as important. And I think this is especially true of people who are managing these content creation departments, and that's because they want to be able to show other managers or executives that the company's content really does have value. And while it might be evidence of a growing trend, it may also just be a hallmark of which companies already kind of have a culture of being more motivated or goal-oriented. But I really do think it's an indication of a wider trend, and that more and more companies and content creators in those companies specifically will need to start understanding and caring about content strategy if they really want their content to stay relevant and to keep adding more value to their business. And so I kind of wanted to ask Alan to chime in on this, because I know this sort of is a both complementary and contradictory trend to the one that he discussed earlier.
I think that when you do have content creators who are more cognizant of the value of the content they're creating and how it fits into the big picture, that's great. They're being proactive, and they're looking beyond just, I've got to put out this brochure, I've got to put out this, this help set or whatever it is that they're delivering. They're looking at the bigger picture. Because if these folks who create content don't look at the bigger picture, you're going to have other people come behind you who will. The people you were working with in product development, or the engineers who are, the executives who are managing you. So I think it behooves everyone who is in these content creation groups to see that bigger picture and to contribute the business thinking, and not just the content itself.
Mm-hmm. I agree. It sounds like this is sort of where your trend comes into play, where if we have a company where the content creators are not doing this, then that's where these non-content groups come up and take up some of that slack. So I think that's why we're seeing evidence of both of those things happening.
Yeah, I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. They do tie into each other quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like strategy has to happen, and if the people who are, primarily responsible for the content aren't providing the strategy, then it gets raised to a point where somebody else will. Okay, let's take a look here. Moving on, we have connecting content with not content.
And I have that one. This is Alan again. I probably should start by explaining content versus not content. In this particular case, I consider information that's developed and maintained by people, and that's tech comm, marcom, those kinds of professionals, to be the content. Non-content is the information maintained by a database, code numbers, inventory numbers, and so on. A person is not actively creating or managing that information. A system does. So you can combine both types of this information, and I think it really amplifies the usefulness of content when you do. And here's a good example of that. If you have a customer who is reading online content about the necessary products they need to maintain a piece of equipment that they have bought for your company, it would be really helpful for those customers to know if those materials for that maintenance are in stock at a local supplier. So if that online content integrated real-time stocked inventory information because of a connection to an inventory database, that means those customers get that very important information immediately. And to me, that really is intelligent content at its finest. You are giving readers exactly what they need, exactly when they need it. They don't have to go somewhere else to figure out if that inventory is readily available nearby. They know it is because that information has been integrated with the information that they're reading online.
Bill, do you have some feedback on this?
Well, yes, we're seeing this a lot more now, especially as more and more systems start producing live content, and it really is critical to the customer experience to be able to tie these systems together with the content that's related to them. Trying to think of another example other than the one that Alan had given, but I mean, even looking at things like source code development and being able to push applications out there, especially ones that tie into an API, it would be really nice to have these ties be automatically created or at least managed well between the content itself and some of the functions within the API or some of the triggers within the application itself. And we see that a lot with smartphone apps and some of the smarter Windows and Mac help systems where they allow you to launch things from now and then. But we're seeing this more and more, and especially as things start moving to other formats and start going to the web, to HTML5, so it can be rendered in many different devices. I think it's critical to be able to tie these things together outside of a canned delivery of an executable.
Yeah, so the question I think for the audience is this the trend that you're seeing, this need to tie together content and what we're very elegantly calling not content, for lack of a better word? I also wanted to circle back to the multilingual content development. I did have a comment there from someone who works for a very large company with 180,000 employees around the world. They have standardized on English as the language of business, but she does assure me that they are not necessarily all proficient in that language. As a side note, I've found that even when English is the language of business, what tends to happen is that the local language is the language of the water cooler. So everybody socializes in local language and then has to sort of torture themselves with, oh, now I have to speak English to go to this meeting or to participate in this thing. And you get this very, very odd kind of disconnect between work and in many cases it's, I've seen this a lot in Germany. Meetings are in German unless there's somebody participating who doesn't speak German, in which case it's going to be English. And the meetings in English are quite different from the meetings in German because of the language and the culture issues that are introduced by switching languages. All right, moving on to trend number 5, which is one-size-fits-all authoring.
Ah, yes. Moving away from one-size-fits-all authoring. This is Bill again. And I don't see this so much as a trend as it is just a point in the evolution of content development. So many, many, many moons ago, well, aside from writing with chisel and hammer, we were using separate tools to do separate things. So we were using Microsoft Word to publish print stuff. And we were using RoboHelp or some other help tool to develop online help. And then we used another tool to develop web output. And there was a migration over, well, it was many years in the making, away from using these multiple different authoring tools to standardize on a single tool or a very specific tool set that worked together for multi-channel publishing. And we all saw benefits of doing this because there was one source format that we had to worry about. There was greater peer-to-peer troubleshooting availability. So if you had a problem with the tool you were using, you could call over to the next cube and say, hey, can you help me out? I can't figure out how to do X, Y, or Z. There was standardized training in these companies so that everyone got the same training about using the same tool, and theoretically everyone was happy. And it also built a specialized skill set, which and I hate to use the term, but it kind of gave, well, it gave the false impression of job security, whereas I have this very special skill set to use this very special tool to do the very special thing that I do. And, well, we know how that worked out, but but then came, you know, the integration of you know, part-time contributors and moving to other tools and trying to keep up with all these different new outputs that need to be addressed. In the case of the part-time contributors, you know, content authoring is not their main job, so they do not have the time or the ability or the inclination to learn a specific authoring tool just to get what's in their head out into the system. So this led to a lot of misuse of tools, whether it be accidental or intentional. The intentional ones would be to avoid all formatting at all costs because they just want to get the stuff out of their head and move on with their day. And you also had the additional cost of having to buy licenses for these part-time contributors, whether it's floating or static licenses. So it ended up being, you know, a cost sink as well. And all these people want to do is just get in, write stuff up, and get out. So we're seeing more and more companies actually adopting, you know, or continuing to move on with a single managed source format, but one that's multi-tool friendly. And we're mainly seeing this in XML, surprise, surprise. This way, writers aren't tied to one specific tool. You know, they can use what they're comfortable with. If it's, you know, whether they're using XMetal or Oxygen or anything else to develop XML-based content, they can even use Microsoft Word with the right plugins. And we're also seeing that part-time contributors can do the same thing. They can be given a very simple template that gets transformed well into a specific structure that's sucked into the content repository, or they can use web forms and just type their information into the form exactly where it needs to be, and then the structure is just wrapped around those fields, and it produces the correct structure for being used within the content at large. And this also, aside from using all these different tools and allowing people to use what they're comfortable with, much like you would have in a development environment where code is code and it doesn't matter what tool you use to write it, you're also able to pull content from other sources. And this is kind of what you know, we were talking about with Alan a little while ago. You can pull content from code. You can pull content from specifications. You can pull content from SAP and push content to SAP. All of these different things can start happening. And the beauty of moving away from this one-size-fits-all is that you don't have to rely on desktop tools for your publishing. The CMS handles the storage. It does the publishing. It gets all those checks and balances in place, so you don't have to sit there and wrangle your content. There's no need to train on specific formatting conventions anymore because it's just information types. You just tag stuff, and a lot of times the structure will define, you know, what it is that these bits of content need to be tagged as. You get quicker contributions from people, especially those who, you know, who have a job that's different than content authoring and just need to contribute something quicker. And therefore you get fewer errors because they're given a very limited set of options to choose from when putting content in. They're not given FrameMaker and, you know, for example, and they have to figure out how to use styles and how to use cross-references and how to use conditional text. They just type stuff into a field or type stuff into a spreadsheet and they're done. And this way the content can be leveraged and reused however it's needed to be used, and it doesn't need to be massaged every time someone needs to touch it.
So the question here, for those of you that are on the call, is this something that you're doing? So are you in various tools with different source formats? Do you manage your content centrally? Do you use various tools that have one shared source? What does that look like? And is this sort of idea of diversity in authoring tools something that you're seeing in your organization? One thing that I'll say is it seems like this ties into some of the stuff that Alan and Gretyl raised, in that if content is going to be produced across the organization by non-content specialists, right? I mean, if a content specialist is somebody whose job is to produce content each and every day, if content is produced by a non-content person or a non-content specialist, then isn't the implication of that you have to give them a tool that is reasonable for them to master, given that they spend 20% of their time on this, or 10%, or 5%, as opposed to lots and lots and lots of people trying to learn a really scary professional tool. I mean, if you take, InDesign, which is not the most TechCom-friendly tool necessarily, but if you take InDesign as an example, if you're going to use InDesign, you had better be spending a large percentage of your time in InDesign, because if you use it part-time, you're going to make a big mess. And I speak from bitter personal experience. Alan, where do you see this falling in with some of the stuff that you're looking at?
It's a business requirement need. It seems to me everything we're talking about circles back to this need, is that business requirements should be driving things. And I saw that in action not too long ago. I was at a client site, and we were talking about tool sets and offered to train some folks in the IT department on the tool set, and the director of IT said, "Thank you very much, but I'm going to stop you right there. My IT folks do not need this particular bit of knowledge. We can find people, resources outside the company and on a contract basis to handle that when we need it, but that level of knowledge, it doesn't serve the organization as a whole for them to have it for this specialized particular tool." And I think that fits in very well with this discussion right now, trying to tailor these tools to exactly what people need, and in some cases they don't need a big overblown, or not overblown, that's unfair, I would say very fully featured thing. It depends on what that particular user needs to get their job done in the process for reviewing and developing content.
So a couple of things here. Gretyl, I want to get you to jump in on this too, but I've got a couple of interesting comments here. One is, and again, somebody says that, they're in a dozen content silos and it's a big mess. It causes problems. And, even without having seen the next comment, you kind of already know why this is the case. Why are there a dozen content silos? And the answer is acquisition, right? That this particular organization has acquired a number of other organizations, and so what happens is that you inherit, or the new overall organization ends up with half a dozen, and then more than that, different tools, because every single organization coming in that's getting merged in has their own stack of tools and perhaps doesn't necessarily want to give it up. So that's a huge change management issue. Somebody else said RoboHelp consistent all the way across, training provided for review to QA. So QA presumably reviews the stuff, and they have training to help them use RoboHelp. Here's somebody else who says, within TechPubs we use a single tool, but in the past year we've started working with other teams outside of TechPubs that use other tools, and that's a pretty common kind of use case, I think. Gretyl, you wanted to jump in on this.
Yeah, so I think that having one single source for your content, but then still having these different tools that can connect with it, I see a big way that this can help mitigate some of these issues with change management and learning curve especially, because if you have a situation like you mentioned where there's acquisition and maybe someone, a manager, an executive, sees all these different silos and tools and says, okay, let's get rid of this and just do one source with one tool that everyone has to learn, that's going to cause a lot of frustration, I think, unnecessarily with this whole issue of change management. So I think that with this idea that Bill's saying and this trend where if you just have one kind of source storage for your content, but then you have a lot of flexibility in the kinds of tools that can connect to it, that can help make sure that these very different groups can still be productive and contribute to the content as they need to, and not have to deal with the headache and frustration of this major learning curve of being sort of forced to learn a new tool that maybe they really don't need to.
Okay. All right, let's take a look here. We have one final trend.
Yes, and that one is my trend. And this is the idea of what happens where once you're in DITA, now what? And I'm starting to see a second wave of content strategies involving DITA, where the first wave was a lot of people asking, do we need DITA? And now that it's kind of becoming more widely adopted, I'm seeing the second wave of people saying, we're in DITA, so now what? And this is basically about strategies that are focused on how you make your existing DITA implementation work better for your business. And that might involve something like making sure that everyone who has to use DITA knows how to use it really well, knows how to use it most effectively. It could also mean tailoring your DITA solution to further your content needs. And so maybe you started in sort of very basic standard DITA, and now you want to create a custom specialization that suits your content better. And it could also just mean exploring what DITA can do beyond just being a solution to your problems. What can it do now to further your content development? So I have two examples I kind of want to present where one is a more optimistic approach to this and one is maybe a not so optimistic but possibly more realistic approach. So with this optimistic or ideal example, this would be, for example, a company that needed their content to be structured in a way that made localization and reuse more efficient. So those were the two issues they were focusing on. And they decided to implement DITA to solve these problems, and the implementation went well. It went according to the strategy that they proposed, and it was overall successful. And so now that those immediate problems of localization and reuse are solved, now the company is going to start realizing that they have something very powerful on their hands with DITA, and that it can do a whole lot more than just resolve those two issues that they originally set out to resolve. So now that their problems are out of the way, they're going to start becoming more interested in the future and in their goals for their content. And they're going to start looking at new strategies and new ways that this DITA solution they already have can help them to grow and meet those goals. And I think we're going to start seeing more of these kind of strategies where you have DITA as a given and you're focusing on the future and kind of exploring the boundaries of what DITA can do as DITA 1.3 starts to become more widely used and more people start to use DITA in general. But for the kind of not so optimistic example, and this is something we've definitely seen happen. So let's say we have another company that has adopted DITA as their solution, but maybe they didn't really have quite as good reasons for doing so. So this company might have had to make a really hasty decision to avoid losing some funding, so they just picked DITA and went with it. Maybe they just didn't do enough research on the front end or come up with a very solid content strategy, and then they ended up with a solution that wasn't a great fit. Or maybe they just moved to DITA because they were seeing others in the industry around them doing that, and they didn't want to get left behind, so they kind of jumped on the DITA bandwagon. But in any case, moving to DITA under these circumstances would not have been the best fit for them. Implementation didn't go as smoothly or as successfully as they had planned. And so now they're looking at, we're in DITA, now what, from a completely different perspective, because they're saying, now how do we make this work for us? So a company like this is going to be investigating strategies that are designed to either help them get out of DITA and find something better, or in finding ways to make this DITA that they're essentially stuck with work better for them and kind of tailoring it to their needs a little bit more. Maybe they do this through specialization. Maybe they combine their DITA implementation with some other kind of content development solution. Or maybe they just take a more gradual shift. So they've implemented DITA, but maybe they're still using some unstructured solution, whatever they were using before, like maybe Word or FrameMaker on the side. And they come up with a plan to kind of use those two concurrently until they can sort of catch up in DITA and make that work better for them. But whether a company is kind of in the more positive category with being in DITA, or whether they're in this sort of more or less optimistic example, once they've adopted it, they'll need to keep coming up with strategies that make their DITA solution better and better. And that's because DITA is an evolving technology. So to get the most out of it, content strategies are going to need to continue evolving with it. And so one question I kind of wanted to propose to Alan and Bill, either of you want to jump in, is how much do you think this idea of sort of jumping on the DITA bandwagon actually factors in, and do you think that actually does play a role in why people might choose DITA for the wrong reasons and get stuck?
I think it does to some extent. And I've been listening to the two sides that you proposed, and I think there's also a middle ground there where they actually have a valid reason for moving to DITA. So they have this reuse and translation need, which are usually the two biggest drivers for moving in to DITA or any other XML type of content authoring. But they do it with just those clear, just those two goals in mind, and they don't keep in mind all of the other things that are going on around them and what those other needs might be, 1 year down the road, 5 years down the road. So they get to a point where they're like, great, we've got reuse, we've reduced our translation costs by 20%, and now what do we do with this content, because we're still producing the same stuff. I'm not really sure how to, I'm really sure if I have an example that talks to your specific question, but I just wanted to point that out, that there are those companies that lie in the middle of those two ranges of the good and the bad reasons for moving to DITA. And a lot of times things can get cloudy as they go down that road. They kind of get focused in on the reuse, and they get focused in on the translation savings, and they don't see the bigger picture as they dive deeper into the weeds.
Alan, do you have some feedback on this as well?
I do, and I think there's another factor that we need to talk about in here, and that is vendors. A lot of tool vendors, have very specific agendas, and that is we want to sell as much as possible, which is all good and well. That is what they're there to do, to sell their tool and make a profit. However, they are going to push an agenda. A lot of times it's their particular tool or DITA or whatever it is, and if you are evaluating all the different tools that are out there, you need to really take any kind of guidance you get from vendors with a grain of salt. I am not saying they're all out there telling you lies or whatever else. It's just you need to have your business goals and requirements in mind. See how well those things match up to what the tool vendors are telling you. And if there is a disconnect there, then it's not a good solution for you. So don't jump into a tool because a vendor says they can help you out or because you've heard that DITA is really helpful. It may not be for you. And you need to do your homework and really look at what your requirements are before you go out shopping for tools and listen to what all the tool vendors are telling you.
I did want to ask that question. So for the audience that's on the call, if you wouldn't mind, are you, where are you with DITA? Is it something you're using? Is it something you've decided not to use? Are you looking for a way out of DITA? Are you looking for a way to take better advantage of DITA? Are you just getting started? Where are you with that? For context, we know that about 80% of the work that we do is related to XML, and about 80% of that is DITA. Now, that doesn't mean that that's true for the industry overall, but that's the kind of pattern that we're seeing from our customers right now. The other thing I wanted to throw in here, I do find this idea of a second wave really, really interesting because I think wave one was definitely all about efficiency and cost reduction, and now there's the second wave, which ties into some of the other things we've talked about, like gluing together disparate systems and being able to do that because you have XML and specifically DITA as a transport layer. I'm not aware of anybody, sort of in our small circle of customers that is seriously looking at bailing out of DITA. But I do hear people talking about things like Markdown, especially in very small organizations. So I'm kind of curious to see what kind of feedback we get here, understanding, of course, that our audience is self-selecting in all sorts of interesting ways. So let me take a look here. I've got one that's saying we're evaluating. somebody who is happily in Madcap's lair and has no intention of changing it. Finally going into DITA after years of trying to get there with the goals of reuse and customer-facing searchable information, which is interesting because if you think about it, reuse tends to be an efficiency, cost reduction goal, and customer-facing searchable information is more of a phase, a second wave quality goal. So that seems like a sensible thing to pair together because it will get you not just an argument on cost avoidance, but an argument on some other things as well. Using DITA, looking for ways to use it more effectively. Here's the cautionary note. We have been using DITA for about 9 years. We were not prepared for the overhead of implementing it. That, I would argue, is our job here at Scriptorium, is that if we're working with somebody, there should not be surprises in terms of, this is going to be hard and expensive. We typically tell people that. And as a counterpoint to that, and I swear this was written before, I didn't read this before I said that, here's another comment from a different person who says, I love DITA, but the challenge was always the implementation and production. The pain was getting real answers without having to buy a consultant or vendor's services. I think all of us on this call are in full agreement as to how you solve that particular problem. Somebody else is evaluating, and somebody else has said we have postponed CMS discussions until the team is up and running on DITA. We won't have a good audience for evaluation. So learn DITA first and then take a look at the CMS. Gretyl, is there anything in there that surprises you that you want to touch on?
Not so much that surprises me, but that sort of goes along with this idea that you were mentioning about these first and second waves and how these responses sort of fit into that in both categories. And I think this goes back also to what Alan and Bill had to say, which is that I think when it comes to DITA or really to any content solution, you have to sort of keep in mind both the idea of what your needs are, which I think sort of corresponds to that first wave that's more about efficiency, and then also what your goals are. And that kind of goes more into the idea of the second wave in the future. So I think to have the best strategy that's going to be the best fit for you, whether that is DITA or something else, you always have to have your eye on both what's best for your company right now versus what's going to be best down the road, and you can't ever let one of those kind of outweigh the other. You have to always keep them both at the forefront when you're making these decisions.
So a couple of other comments. This one clearly struck a nerve. We have a comment from somebody who says she works in a large company and her division was created via acquisition, as someone mentioned. 2 of the parts of the department are using DITA at a limited level, implying some of the others are not. Difficult to be able to have writers to switch writing jobs when we are on different tools and using and not using DITA. So this is a mixed environment where some content is in DITA and some content is not, and the writers are being asked to switch back and forth, which I'm not sure I've ever seen that before. That's actually very interesting. And then finally, here's an excellent question, which I will throw open to the group. It's a bit of a scary one, so Gretyl, I'll start with you, but the other two can think about it while you're afraid of this question. So the question is, do you have an example of a customer who went to DITA and should not have, and why? Or an example, maybe not. I don't think we have a customer in particular.
I don't know if we have a customer, but I think
someone.
So I think an example of that would be, I think mostly if you go to DITA too hastily. So for me, that would mean you didn't consider what your actual content requirements were, and you just moved to DITA anyway. This may be a case where you have too small of a collection of content to justify the cost of moving to DITA. This may be a case where you have too few writers, or this may be a case where a lot of your content itself is not actually suited to the structure of DITA, but you wanted some of the benefits of it, like the reuse, like the localization, etc. and so you move to it anyway without thinking about how it wouldn't really work for you once you got into it.
Bill or Alan, did you want to jump in on that?
Sure. I've seen cases where a company comes to us, or at least comes in saying, we want to move to Ditto. We've done our homework. We know that this is the solution that we want. These are the reasons. This is the goal that we have. And as you do a little more digging, you find out that, well, the writers aren't really keen on switching from a tool that they really like using to something that they don't know anything about or very little about, or that it suddenly occurs to the bean counters at the company that, oh, wait a minute, this isn't just a matter of buying them a new tool. This is a heavy implementation impact on the budget. Or that they finally realize that the implementation is not going to be easy. We try to be very upfront with our customers about that. But it finally hits them in the head that this isn't a 3 to 6 months engagement. That this is a commitment that's going to last several years, at least on their part, to get things up and running and get content developed, to iron out all the wrinkles in the transform process. So yeah, I've seen cases where at least I can't think of any where they've gone down the road far enough and then went, oh no, and tried to back out as quick as possible. But I've seen cases where they've wanted to go down that road, and the more that they learned about what it means to travel that path, they backed out.
There are definitely some factors that we look for. A critical mass of content, a critical mass of authors. Localization is probably the #1 reason that people move into XML and Ditto, because of the formatting automation, which is a huge business case contributor. I will say that certainly I have spoken to people who are considering it and where it was not the appropriate answer because they didn't have the scale or the organizational maturity or some of the other stuff that you've touched on. So I would agree with that. All right. Alan, did you want to jump in? Did you get a chance to talk about that? We've got about...
I think my coworkers have covered that very well. We only have about 3 minutes left anyways.
All right. So I am going to wrap this up here. For those of you that are on the call, if you have any last-minute questions, we have about 2 minutes left to answer possibly one question. I actually really like the went to Ditto and should not have question. But generally, I'll just, circle back to that and say that this is like anything else, and you need to implement a tool or a technology or a process for the right reasons, and there should be a business case there. If the business case isn't there, then I don't care what you're trying to do, you're going to have trouble.
Mm-hmm. And I would say if there are any additional questions beyond the scope of this webcast, definitely post them to Twitter with the Content 2016 hashtag, and we'll do our best to get back to you.
Yeah, or send us an email if you really don't want to put it out there on Twitter for some odd reason. Okay, with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Gretyl, Bill, and Alan, thank you very much. I think this was, to me, a lot of interesting stuff there, and I live and breathe this stuff. Thank you to our participants. We will have a recording out, we hope within 24 hours, but certainly give us till the end of the week just in case. And we look forward to seeing you on the next event. Thank you, everybody.